warm welcome to everybody. There are several people who are here for the first time, and without wanting to embarrass you unduly, it probably would be sensible and helpful for you to identify yourselves so that we can make sure we make a beeline for you and perhaps you for each other. So if it's not too embarrassing to just raise a hand, yes, and identify yourselves here for the first time. That's an enormous percentage of the group, so we've got a lot of work to do in terms of making sure everybody feels at home and relaxed. Please do, if there's anything at all that we can help to make today as easy for you as possible, please do grab any of us with a UCL badge. There are staff standing up all around the room at the moment. I'm Jill Walton and Emily Brotherhood, who most of you will have corresponded with prior to today, are on hand to answer any questions that we can. Thank you for coming. I'm aware that it's a hugely daunting prospect to enter a room full of people that you don't necessarily know, and I really hope that what you gain from today is beneficial. And thank you to all who have returned again, and some of you again and again, and who kind of formed this nucleus of a really valuable contact with people, and hopefully for yourselves too, as this support group functions. One or two quick housekeeping notices. There are no fire alarms planned, so if the fire bell does ring, you have to leave the room by any of the two exits and congregate in the quadrangle at the front. We have actually only one visitor now to today's meeting, but I wanted to just explain to you, we do get regularly asked by people who would like to come and sit in on meetings from a whole range of interested other professionals. And so we try to pick quite carefully those for whom we think observing a group like this will be beneficial to them, but also to you in the long term. And then very quickly, just to mention the international seminar, the 10th international seminar on frontotemporal dementia, which takes place in Munich in August of this year. And I really mention it not because many of us will be able to go, but just because it marks a real development in our understanding and the progress that is fast overtaking our kind of misperceptions of frontotemporal dementia. So the scientific background on which our understanding is based is really thrashed out at those international meetings. And we do have scientists from UCL who are here with us today who will be presenting at that meeting, which is fantastic to know. And on top of the international science presentations, there is a Caregivers Day where our support group is represented and where we very much kind of pull together with support groups from across the world to kind of try and look at ideas to best move forward. And on that note, we will be working with that international group to promote the second World FTD Awareness Week later this year. So I will email you later with details of that. And a bit closer to home and sooner in diary sort of spectrum is our annual seminar on March the 10th. Details are on the back literature table, and please feel free to take those away and of course to join us on March the 10th for that all-day seminar of frontotemporal dementia-specific lectures. So to move on to our morning agenda, if I may, obviously we have two sort of guest speakers in a way this morning. The second I'll introduce in a moment, but the first is a gentleman by the name of Rob Perry, who is joining us as a support group as the new London Regional Volunteer Facilitator. So it doesn't take very much for you to work out that if we've got a new one, we must have had an old one. Not very old. Actually, we can't introduce Rob without saying a proper thank you to Carol. Carol, do please come on. Carol has served the support group for, I think, 16 years as the regional contact person for London. I know that your I know that Carol's original remit and reason for being part of the group was very personal, and that Carol's husband had frontotemporal dementia. But obviously you have served us for many years since obviously your husband died. I know you wanted to say a couple of words before I introduce Rob.
Oh, well, yes. As you said, Jill, I've been doing this for 16 years, So my remit goes back to the late 1990s, and I feel now that fresh ideas can be brought to the table, and I'm most grateful to Rob for saying that he will take this on. Thank you.
We'll just hand over to Rob, who is going to spend just a couple of minutes introducing himself to you, explaining a little bit about his reasons for me to step forward and take on this role.
Pass the first test. Well, I'd just like to say thank you to Carol as well. It's an honour to be taking over from you, and I look forward to helping as many people that you've proved to help as well through your time. And the reason I'm taking on this role is personal as well. My mother was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia in 2011, and that's a picture of me near the last few months when she was alive, when she lost mobility. She died in 2013, and I was a primary carer for 2.5 years. And it was, obviously a very difficult time. She was diagnosed just after I finished university in 2008, just a couple of days after I got a phone from my dad saying that she had diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia. This is our family here, the Jubilee, so it's my mum and dad, and my sister and brother and my sister's children and grandparents. So we all really clubbed together to help care for mum. And as a primary carer, I took control of power of attorney and to care home matters and all the private care and things along those lines. So I got quite a good insight really into caring for someone with FTD. And whilst caring, I was receiving carers allowance at one point. I had a night job and I was studying for my MA. So it's a really difficult time, but we managed to get through it okay. Mum, we really embraced Mum's change in humour. This is her in the care home on her last birthday, with a doll of Harry Styles from One Direction, who she came to absolutely adore. She became really her interest became really childlike, and her other half was Ollie Mers, and that's her meeting Ollie Mers. With my sister arranged it by queuing outside Waterstones for 12 hours the weekend before to get a ticket, and he was very nice. He signed a book for her, gave her a kiss, and she absolutely loved it. So. Since diagnosis, I've tried to help other people in a similar situation. So this is me recently speaking at the BBC after it was a study by UCL looking at how changes in sense of humour are linked to frontotemporal dementia diagnoses. And I know Philip in the audience as well also spoke about that. So I did some interviews for local radio there, and I've written articles for websites about surviving as a carer for someone with FTD, and I've also written on Young Dementia's new website about the difficult decision of trying to find the right care home for someone with FTD. And this was a blog on Alzheimer's research I wrote about. This is the first Christmas without Mum. And I have a blog where I've interviewed some people, so people might like to read this. I've interviewed carers or loved ones who are affected by FTD, including Deborah Thelwell, her book's actually at the back over there. So these are quite long interviews about kind of some of the fine points of what it's like caring for someone with FTD. And I'm available on social media, on Twitter as well, where I share stories related to FTD that appear in the media. So yeah, I mean, my role as a regional contact, I've already started helping people who contacted me by giving as much advice and emotional support as I can. And yeah, I look forward to continuing that role with the charity, really. You know, so nice to meet everyone. Any questions or anything?
Just a big welcome.
Okay.
Thank you. And so without further ado, I think I need to introduce Bethany. Lovely, thank you. So Bethany is our speaker this morning. She's going to be talking about the changes in empathy that are noticed often very, very early on, as you will well know, alongside a diagnosis of untitled dementia. Beth is a researcher at Cardiff University and is going to speak to us now to the group. We don't have a roaming microphone, so if you have questions for Beth, whilst she's happy to take them, it would be advisable that she repeats them out to the group so that we can all benefit from any questions that you may choose to ask along the way. And apart from that, there will be a question and answer session or a possibility of questions at the end of Beth's presentation. So if Beth, you would mind coming, it's really lovely to welcome you. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to hearing what your research into changes in empathy can share with us.
Okay, so as Jill says, what I'm going to be talking to you about today are some of the changes that might happen in empathy in frontotemporal dementia. And I'm a researcher at Cardiff University, as he said, and what I do often is look at brain imaging scans. And I'm interested in the way that empathy is represented within the brain and how some of the changes that happen in frontotemporal dementia lead to the behavioural changes that we might see in empathy and social abilities. I'm also interested in understanding how these changes impact on the quality of life of caregivers and relationships that people might have. I'm not going to talk too much about that today, because obviously you have far more experience in that area than I do. And I'm actually going to mention a study at the end that I'm currently conducting in case anyone's interested. What I'm really going to focus on today is our scientific understanding of what do we think empathy is, and why do we think that we might see changes in empathy in the frontotemporal dementias, and a brief bit on the effects that these changes might have on people who look after people with frontotemporal dementia. So the images are just to show you what I kind of do on a day-to-day basis, and we're interested primarily in the connections between different parts of the brain and the role that connections have. And we give people these kind of images of different facial expressions and try to get people to pick out the expressions that people think are being shown. So I'll also go on and explain some of the issues that we have with some of these tests later on. Because there are some issues with testing, such as subtle abilities such as empathy and social understanding, with very broad stroking tests like these. But first off, what I wanted to go over is what really do we think empathy is and how do we understand empathy. So broadly, we define empathy as the ability to understand and share in the feelings of other people. And while we might think of it as a quite straightforward thing that we do every day, it's actually an incredibly complicated ability and involves lots of different components to be able to perform and feel as such. And it's an ability that we all know develops over decades. Children don't have the same kinds of abilities that adults do. And we know also that it's variable in different populations. Some people are incredibly good at understanding the feelings of other people, and some people find that a lot harder. But it's something that really is stable. In the general population, if you're very poor at empathy when you're young, you're generally going to be relatively poor as you get older. But as you well know, one of the exceptions to this is the people who might have a diagnosis of frontotemporal dementia. can happen in all of the different variants. And in the behavioural variant, the changes in empathy can often occur very early on and progress across the course of time. I'm going to mention some of the other subtypes of people, primarily behavioural variant, and have experienced behavioural variant here. But the changes that we see in empathy can differ across the subtypes. And that sort of really shows us there are very big differences in the way that empathy is structured within the brain and different areas of the brain that are affected. And we can really see that some abilities might change in empathy while others can stay intact. So for example, somebody might find understanding an emotion that's expressed in somebody else's face really hard and really not be able to completely understand what expression it is. While they might still be able to act appropriately if someone's told the emotion that they're feeling. So this really shows that there are lots of different aspects that combine together to result in changes in the ability to understand other people's feelings and thoughts. And this is sort of what leads us on to say how complicated empathy is, and that's what I'm going to kind of cover for you today. So we can think of empathy as a kind of umbrella term. So it's not a single thing that exists. It's a composite of lots of different abilities and lots of different processes that work together to allow us to behave in the way that we would say is empathic. And I like to think about this as a bit like a pyramid, so that each of these different abilities and processes sort of build on each other, and you require the abilities at the bottom to be able to carry on up the pyramid and perform abilities that come above until the final level of what we might think of as doing something that's empathic. So to give a bit of an example, if we see an emotional expression like this, what we first need to do is to be able to just see what's going on. We need to see that the mouth's downturns, that the eyebrows are close together, and that that's a change from a normal resting face. This information we then have to understand as indicating sadness, that these expressions are what happens when somebody is sad. Once we've identified that that means sadness, we then need to understand what sad means, understand what it feels like, all the kinds of things that go with what sadness is. And it's only once we do this and then able to apply that to understand that that's happening in somebody else that we can then, that we can then understand that that other person is experiencing sadness and behaving in an appropriate way. So the issues that might come in empathy can be because some of these elements might be lacking or there might be difficulties in them that impair this process of one piece of information going from one stage to the next. So for example, if we lose this emotion detection phase and we show somebody a face like this, you might be able to perceive that the mouth's downturns, that the eyebrows are coming together. But the stage at which that understanding moves to understanding that that is a sad face, there might be problems in that phase, at which point you can't then understand, you can't get to the point of knowing what sadness feels like and understanding that that person is feeling sad. So we can't get to the final stage of acting in an empathic way. But going back to what I was saying before, if we have a difficulty in one area, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything is difficult. So, like I said before, if somebody might be told that this person is sad, we might be able to use other ways of understanding how to act if other aspects of the parent are intact. So, if you were told someone's sad, I'm having no issues with the language. So if we know that somebody is sad, we might be able to use a different process of understanding that other people experience emotions that might be different to ourselves, but we might not need to be able to understand what face that's associated with. understanding. And you can then see that the other person is sad. The other person has these emotions that we attribute to sadness, to be able to get to that kind of active empathy in a different way. So, what does this have to do with frontotemporal dementia? Well, different regions of the brain are involved in each of these different components of empathy that I've mentioned and talked about. And they're spread out across the brain in lots of different areas. If I highlight the regions that we generally think are primarily involved in empathy and social understanding, and then I highlight the fact that this here is the frontal lobe, this here is the temporal lobe, and those are the two regions that give their name to the frontotemporal dementias. You can see why we might well have difficulties with empathy, and these two regions are the regions that are really affected in the frontotemporal dementias, because a lot of the components that we really require for empathic processing are located in these regions. So, just going back to how I was explaining pyramids, you can see we can have information that comes in, is processed in one area, moved to the next, processed in the next, and then we end up in what we might say is empathic behaviour. But in the brain it's a lot more complicated than just one process moving to the next. And we would say that empathy is actually a network. So all of these regions, rather than feeding one to the other, are going backwards and forwards, feeding in different ways. So this is one of the reasons why the changes that might happen can be very complicated and not follow a very obvious pattern of what we might expect for one change to be related to a different change. So, as I was saying, the changes in empathy that we see in frontotemporal dementia are really because of the location of brain changes that happen in these conditions. So, the brain changes by proteins accumulating and changes happening to the cells that make up the brain. In the behavioural variant, this really primarily in the first off happens in these frontal regions that I've highlighted in the red. And you can see by looking at the green areas that are highlighted as sort of empathy specific areas, you can really see why the behavioural variant we see quite a lot of profound changes in empathy, as a lot of the really large areas involved and required for empathic processing are located in this area where the first changes really happen. If I highlight this in the other areas, say for example semantic dementia, a lot of changes happen in this lower area. So you can see why changes might be different across the different subtypes, because the first sort of areas that might be affected might be slightly different, and the different sort of green areas that I've highlighted, so the different processes that are required might be different. So the flow of information that I was talking about before in the different subtypes might be affected at different stages. So you might have different abilities that you can do, that you can't do, and what changes might happen in. Again, so the progressive non-primitive phases again slightly different and a little bit further back and a bit more spread out. And you can see that the large green areas are slightly separate to this, which is why some of the changes might be slightly later or slightly more subtle in these subtypes, and similarly in long-period dementia. And again, there's some areas that are involved, but they're smaller and there's not so much in this primary main system. So the changes might be slightly later or slightly more subtle. Okay, so really just to go over what I was saying before, with the pyramid, but in the example of in the brain. If we have a change in the brain that affects one of these regions, such as here, so represented by the loss of that green region, and the flow of information can come in, it can go through some of the processing, some of our abilities might be intact, but when we get to this stage, the process at this point can't happen, which means that the information can't be passed on to the later processing stages. Empathy can't happen. And similarly, as I was saying, I'm very interested in the connections between these regions as well as the actual structure of information can't pass, then obviously can't result in that final stage of the pyramid and go all the way up to the top. So, what are the important things that I think are quite relevant to caregiving and for supporting people with dementias? Well, what I really wanted to highlight is that the brain changes are causing difficulties and changes in how the information is processed when we're trying to do something that might be seen as empathic. So understanding the facial expression of other people, understanding why people think in the way that they do. These are all components of what we would call empathy and sit underneath the umbrella. And it's the changes in the brain that are causing these difficulties. And the fact that there are some abilities that might be preserved that are quite similar to some difficulties that there might be challenges, areas that there might be challenges in, doesn't mean that the areas that there are challenges are intentional at all. It just means that the changes, because of the way that empathy is structured in the brain, one area which might be have difficulties in it, and so some abilities are still there, but very similar abilities might be have problems in those areas. So it's really the changes in the brain causing the changes in people's ability to behave, not any kind of choice or intentionality and those kind of things. It's really because there's changes occurring in the brain that are causing the difficulties. And it's because empathy is so complicated and has all of these loads of different components that it's hard for us to really understand why there are changes in some areas and not in others, because of this flow of information being able to go in lots of different ways and go through different routes. So yeah, just because it doesn't sort of necessarily make sense from our logicalisation as we understand people doesn't necessarily mean it's choice-based. So an example of how this kind of extrapolates into the wider context and wider behaviour is something that we call theory of mind, but we can generally imagine it as being putting yourself into somebody else's shoes. Now, this is a really key component of empathy, and we can imagine that being able to understand how somebody else is feeling is really based on the fact that we can understand where somebody else is and put ourselves into their shoes. And this is, as I say, one of the components under this umbrella. If you have difficulties in this area, then the challenges that you might face spread out into a whole load of other different domains, because, as I say, that one component bases on the other and can have ongoing effects. So there's something that we describe as self-conscious emotions, which are things like shame, pride, guilt, or embarrassment. And these emotions are really based on our ability to understand somebody else's point of view. Because if we do something that we might feel embarrassed about, we feel embarrassed because we understand that other people might be putting a judgment or looking at us in a particular way because of what we're doing. If we can't understand that somebody else might have a different point of view to ourselves, or other people might think of behaviours in a different way to ourselves, then we won't necessarily be able to feel those emotions because we don't think that what we're doing is wrong if we don't, or inappropriate if we can't understand that somebody else might dislike what we're doing. If we're on a quiet train and we want to be loud, but we don't understand that other people might want to be quiet, then we don't necessarily see the issue in being loud. Because why would you? I want to be loud, other people probably want to be loud as well. So it's really, as I say, sort of based on this first stage that may have ongoing effects into wider social behaviours and everyday actions. And so, yeah, how you behave in public can actually be based on changes in this empathy system, based on your ability to understand other people's points of view. So, with our current knowledge on empathy changes in the FTDs, as I say, self-conscious emotions, what I've just described to you, are one of the sort of large areas where people have processing, that's fine. You don't see that as being a problem. Yeah, that's being a problem. So we kind of can see that these abilities to be embarrassed, find our own behaviour embarrassing, there can be some difficulties in those kind of areas. And as I say, this is really based on that kind of ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, as I say, can have wide-reaching impacts on the way that we behave in everyday life. If we can't put ourselves in someone else's brain, we can't necessarily see what they want, understand why they might think something different to ourselves, or they might want something different to ourselves. And so that's one. You can see changes in some basic emotions sometimes. Sometimes people particularly have difficulties with all those negative emotions, so things like fear or sadness or distress, while people might still be fairly good at understanding happiness. So this is a way that we might sort of find that we categorise emotions as a single thing, but actually emotions can selectively have difficulties or abilities. And as I say, potentially negative emotions might have particular difficulties in some of the frontotemporal dimensions. Another couple of areas, another area where there seems to be some difficulty can be in inferring intentions. So as I say, this is again based on the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes, the ability to understand why somebody else is doing something and where their final goal is. Okay, so as you see, just the last area is inferring the intentions of other people and why they're behaving the way that they are. So just briefly, I'm going to say some of the difficulties that we have in really being able to access and understand the difficulties that people might have. So see, these are some areas where people have done research. They're actually doing research in an area that's so subtle and complicated can be very hard. And this is really because sometimes you end up having to tap in something subtle with an effective manner. Because, as I say, there's so many different components that are involved. Do you test lots? Do people give very large tests, as I say, like picking out faces? So this means that really people's understanding of exactly which of the components that I highlighted before there might be challenges in empathy isn't particularly great. It's an area where there really is a lot of work that's still being done and a lot of work that still needs to be done. So why is it important that we understand empathy change? Well, we know that empathy and social interactions really are the core and foundation of our relationships. And when there are changes in these areas, they can be very difficult to cope with and can be very distressing. And impact on things like the burden that people feel when looking after somebody else, on the quality of life of people, and on bond. It can sometimes lead to things like burnout, which is a real big issue, and it's very important that we understand, and that we understand how to support people so that they don't get to the point of burnout. And we know that frontotemporal dementia is a particularly challenging thing to care for people with. And in comparison to things like Alzheimer's, it can have a real impact on people's quality of life, on the caregivers and burden and things like this. But one of the real difficulties there is at the moment is that research really focuses on Alzheimer's disease because it's far larger, it's far more common. But actually, like I said, it in effect has less of an impact sometimes and it's easier to deal with for the caregivers, which means that there are some areas that are crossover in. So we can support caregivers with frontotemporal dementia in areas where we might already have understanding of their needs from Alzheimer's work. But as I'm sure you know, the vast majority of some of the challenges are very unique to these conditions and don't have crossover with Alzheimer's disease. So So research in Alzheimer's disease really is great to provide the help that is needed. As I say, it's some important differences, and empathy is one of these areas where there really is very sort of no crossover between frontotemporal dementias and Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is, empathy, is one of the abilities that actually is highly maintained in Alzheimer's. So somebody with very progressed Alzheimer's still might not show changes in social interaction, which means that when the research is primarily focusing on Alzheimer's, there really is very little understanding of the needs that people have and the challenges of looking after somebody who might have changes in these kind of domains and these kind of areas. So as I say, there's just very little work in this area, and so there's a lot that needs to be done to really understand what needs people have because of these changes. We do know that the behavioural problems and behavioural symptoms are a very large cause of burden and difficulty for people who are looking after someone with frontotemporal dementia. But as I alluded to earlier, the ways people test these can be very, very broad-reaching and say, are changes in behaviour difficult for you? Yes. Okay, well that doesn't really tell us an awful lot about what we can actually do to help people with those changes or to actually support people, and also why those changes are causing difficulties, which is what we then need to know to be able to support people. So really need to develop a lot more knowledge in this area to be able to really support and help people. And there's a lot of people trying to work on understanding these changes to provide better support for people who are dealing with behavioural and social changes. And this just leads me on to just explain to you a little bit about a piece of work that I'm doing, just in case anybody might be interested. So currently on this area I'm doing some work where I'm really just collecting reports of changes in empathy and social abilities that people who look after people with frontotemporal dementia might have experienced, and to try to collect reports of the impact that people have, these changes have had on people, on their lives and on their caregiving experience, to try to build this better understanding of what aspects of these changes are really causing people difficulties, and what challenges there are for people who are caregiving for people with these changes, to provide a first step towards the development of support and interventions if necessary, and also to see which changes do people actually find difficult, and is there a need for more support in this area? We really think that it is, but people might not feel that. So what the work's involving is interviews with myself, a few hours to talk to people about these changes and their experiences of them. It's very flexible with times and locations and those kinds of things. And it really just covers a little bit of background about relationships and people's experiences, and the changes in empathy that you might have observed, and the impact primarily that these changes might have had on people and the caregiving experience, and whether there are any needs that you feel really aren't addressed in these areas. And also a brief questionnaire pack to address these same kind of issues. So that was mostly what I was hoping to talk to you about today. I hope that some of what I've covered has been helpful or informative for you. But I'm going to be here for the rest of the day. If anybody would like to come to speak to me, please feel free. There's also my email address and work number and the handouts. If you'd like to get in contact, please feel free. So just thank you for listening and great response. From what we know, yes. A lot of our ability to understand other people and empathise seems to be very much in the right hemisphere, in the right lobe, while the left side So yes, there's a right-sided bias, very much. You see very different behaviours towards yourself as compared to behaviours towards other people outside of the home. And when we have an understanding of why that might be the case. I guess it's relatively limited. As you said, there's not a lot of understanding on the real subtleties of these kind of things. Like I said, the tests that people often use are very sort of blunt instruments, to be slightly rude about it, rather than really unpicking and understanding people's minute behaviours. But I guess the likelihood is the kind of level of control that we have over ourselves. And if we understand that we're in a slightly different situation where it requires a very high level of behavioural control, then we might be able to exert more care and sort of being slower in what we do to be able to try to control. Because as I was saying, the areas that are involved in empathy are changing, but it's not that they're completely gone. The abilities might still be there in some ways, but sort of gross behaviours might be changed. So when we're not necessarily watching ourselves all the time, they might come out more in a more profound way, because there's less taking the time to really watch what you're doing, which you can allow yourself to do if you're only out for an hour or 2 hours, whereas for the rest of the day you can't necessarily do that all of the time. So a lot of the work that has been done in 2 major areas. Either doing research with people where we know there are changes in empathy, and looking at where is change in the brain as compared to somebody without changes in empathy. And you really look at which areas might have shrunk and which areas might have visibly changed on something like an MRI scan where you can see the outline of the brain. But a lot of the work has also been done in people, just still undergraduates, for example, and giving people tasks which require empathy in lots of different ways, and then we can do functional scans in which we can look at which areas of the brain are being activated or being involved when these tasks are being done. And when we do that over many, many different tasks with many different sort of variations in them, there are certain areas that come out time and time again. Every time this area is being activated when somebody is doing that task. So really the areas that I was highlighting are kind of a combination of the 2 of those. So if you say, whenever we give someone this task, this frontal part of their brain seems to be involved. And we see when somebody has a difficulty in empathy, this area of the brain is also often very much changed. It seems very likely that that area is one of the areas that's been really critically involved in that process. So, firstly about cross-cultural, different cultures, absolutely. There are some areas where there are differences across cultures. Even in some aspects of facial expressions, they actually change depending on the culture people come from. But the basic abilities are very much preserved across different places in terms of expressions of emotion. But as you say, the tools that are used are very poor, I'm going to say. It's very hard to tap into these things that are very subtle and, as you say, very contextual. So people are starting to try to bring in context to understand changes, but we're still a long way from really being able to tap into subtleties. So that's why I personally think it's very important to actually also involve things like speaking directly to people who have experience and collecting verbal reports, because while you say it's very hard to explain these things, I think at the moment it's really the best way that we have to be able some subtle changes that might not come up on these very crude tasks that are used. But at the moment, really, they are what we have, and they're people trying to develop them and trying to improve. But I think you really need to combine and get reports as well. So language in specific areas, but no, not something specifically like that. I'm not really sure, to be honest, why swear words might be still there when other words are harder to find. Maybe because they're emotionally very strong, and we know very much that if something has a strong emotional feeling attached to it, then our memories for it are a lot stronger. So swear words are often very emotionally powerful words. So it could be that the sort of emotional content and the power that's associated with those words means that there's still a trace of them there, and those things might be harder to find. So they come to mind a lot quicker than maybe more complicated words. But it's fascinating. So changes in disinhibition are certainly changes that occur in the frontotemporal dementias, and they're thought of in on their own as a separate thing to empathy. So there is that ability, the sort of handbrake, stopping ourselves from doing stuff that we know we shouldn't do. There is definitely difficulties that people have in that. And the ability to stop ourselves from doing things that we know we shouldn't do. Absolutely, that happens, and that is separate in many ways to changes in empathy. But as you say, the changes in understanding whether we should do that at all, before we even know whether we need to stop ourselves, are part of this empathy. So both together, you have quite a sort of double whammy, but they're certainly separate as well as both. So trying to paraphrase, I think, you were asking what kind of vocabulary is involved, and that you found changes in vocabulary and language that we use, but the test and the software used is sort of doesn't tap into some of these behavioural and empathy changes. So for me personally, my work I try to completely avoid words because there are difficulties that people can have in language and words that are separate to the difficulties that people can have in empathy and social understanding. So for my work personally, I try to avoid words as much as possible to try to get the raw experience. But people certainly do research on words, and on words in the empathy context, and also words generally and people's language. And your comment about memory problems and memory tests, I think that's a very common difficulty, and that's a real issue that there is at the moment. As I said, that Alzheimer's being such a common dementia, and memory tests tend to get thrown at people when that's not necessarily the area that difficulties are in. And that's partly because of a lack of knowledge in some cases, or just a probability that's most likely, so people will give those tests often quite early. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Beth. That's amazing. It's really helpful to hear some of the scientific underpinning of what is absolutely, by the nods in the room, really kind of commonplace experience. And only in view of time and the fact that you've answered an awful lot of questions for us, we should probably just hold for a moment here. I think it's important to carry on the discussion around empathy, and we can do that in perhaps a more sensitive sort of manner in our 3 smaller discussion groups after a short break for lunch. So we will pick up on the theme and continue it in terms of sort of more sensitive and personal discussion. And I think in terms of the tools that we were talking about for diagnosing, I know that we've had speakers here before who've also talked about the need to develop diagnostic tools which will pick up those changes that we don't see on the blunt sort of memory assessment as current practice. So thank you, Bethany. I did mention in the agenda that Lynn Ramsey, who's one of our volunteer coordinators, has got a specific request for a brainstorming session that we'll perhaps just attach the first 5 minutes of our discussion to. And Lynn is going to just explain what it is that would be useful for her to have in terms of feedback from each of the groups. But as I say, that's really just our starting for 10 before we move on and obviously sort of address any of the issues that you feel are particularly relevant for your group. So I'll hand over to Lynn for a brief explanation as to what would be helpful for her.
Thank you. This is being done because the government are currently reviewing the Mental Capacity Act. The Mental Capacity Act aims to protect people who lack mental capacity but need to be deprived of liberty in order to receive appropriate care and treatment in hospitals and care in nursing homes. Now this affects a lot of our patients or a lot of our relatives. You might not be aware, but the treatment they get should be in their best interests. And it's a question of whether they have mental capacity. Now, you don't either have or necessarily have not mental capacity. You can have it this morning and not have it this afternoon, and it is actually about each decision being made and type of decision. So I could not have mental capacity to manage my finances, for example, but I could be absolutely sure that I am going to die in my own home and I'm not going to be moved. And I could be deemed to have mental capacity to make that decision. So it's not a one-off. And also, it's not a question of me saying something to you and you repeating it back so that it's obvious your memory is working. You've got to understand the decision that's being made and the consequences of it. Now, it does affect people. Now, I spent most of yesterday on the phone to somebody, for example, and writing letters yesterday afternoon that have gone to the Chief Executive of the Trust, to the Mental Health Trust and the MP, because having been admitted to hospital with FTD, this lady within 10 days could no longer speak, could no longer recognise them, and could no longer do anything. When I eventually got the medication, she's on 16 different medications, including lorazepam, other azepams, olanzapine, and haloperidol, orally and by injection. And she's not supposed to have had any strokes or anything else. Now, I wrote and clearly stated that this is not compliant with the Mental Capacity Act or with the Code of Human Rights. I don't know what well, I've had some phone calls, but I haven't yet taken up their response. But there are brilliant places in this country where we have some of the best medics, we have the best nurses, we have the best management, and the whole thing is integrated. Sadly, as many of you know, I appeal cases for free for people with young onset FTD, and I'm constantly fighting from north to south, all over the country, these individual cases. The government, as I say, thinks that professionals do not understand enough about the Act, that it's not being used correctly. Now, I certainly have a lot of evidence and I have my views, but getting us all together, I thought gave an opportunity for people to have a quick discussion. Please collect it and then give me any other examples where you think you're A, not being listened to, or B, the patient is not getting the best care that they could be having. And I will put that in with, because I've been asked by the government if I'd like to respond to this, and well, obviously I will. I can't make the meeting they're having, but I'm going to put in written response, as I did to a Health Select Committee over antipsychotics and so on. I will do this on the Mental Capacity Act. So now's a chance for us to capture any other examples that you would like to have considered. Thank you.
I know it's hard to put into conversations. I know for some people staying on is a bit more possible than for others, but in view of the fact that we are approaching 2 o'clock, and for those of us or you who've had to make provision to get back at the right time, we will sort of just draw an official sort of end to our meeting today. Obviously, if there are any issues that you want to follow up or any conversations that were half the way through before I really interrupted, please feel free to tie those up in the moments that follow. I just want to kind of thank you really for coming and to say that I hope on balance the meeting has been helpful. If there's anything that has not been, then if you can leave it here. Take what has been helpful and leave what hasn't. But if there's anything that's kind of bothering you or leaves you with questions, then please do follow those through, either directly to Emily, who you've emailed prior to today, or myself, and we'll do our best to follow that through for you. So really I just want to thank Beth again for coming to speak to us today. Thank you very much for being brave enough to venture through these doors. And to just say, I think the quotes on the front of the screen at the moment are two which we show at the end of practically every support group meeting that we have. And I hope convey very much the sentiment of what the purpose of these meetings is. It's fantastic to hear expert speakers, but ultimately it's really, really important to have a place where your story is heard and listened to and appreciated and understood for all that it is. So I wish you safe travels and really, really hope that we'll see you again at future meetings.